Alfred the Great has been found! Or at least that's what the papers have been suggesting.
Recently, my newsfeed exploded with reports of a claim that King Alfred the Great's remains had been found, and that, in a bizarre twist of historical déjà vu, he's buried under a car park, just like Richard III. The claim comes from researcher Graham Phillips, who recently appeared on Blaze TV's Weird Britain. Filmed in Winchester, Graham centres on a little-known account written in 1798 by the antiquarian Henry Howard. He believes Howard's account, together with a map Howard created, could reveal where King Alfred's lost remains still lie today.
Amazing, I thought. If this is true, this would make it one of the most exciting historical discoveries in decades. I'm not, however, one to just take headlines at face value. So I did what I always do. I started digging.
But before we can follow the trail of what may have happened to Alfred's remains, we first need to understand where they were laid to rest in the first place. If there is one king whose name still echoes through history, it is Alfred, the king who stood against the Viking invasions, who championed learning and education, and who helped shape the foundations of the England we know today. He was a warrior, a scholar, and a remarkable survivor, a king so highly regarded that he remains the only English monarch to carry the title the Great. And our story begins where Alfred's earthly life ended, in AD 899. After his death, Alfred was buried in the Old Minster at Winchester. Just 4 years later, his remains were moved to a newly built church on the same site, with the wonderfully original name of New Minster. Then, in 1110, they were translated once again, this time to the even newer church of Hyde Abbey. Medieval records tell us that Alfred was buried before the high altar, alongside his wife Ealhswith and their son, Edward the Elder. As far as we know, Alfred and his family lay undisturbed for more than 4 centuries in the eastern end of Hyde's great monastic church. But something big was about to happen. In April of 1538, the last abbot of Hyde surrendered the abbey at the command of Henry VIII. The dissolution of the monasteries was underway, and Hyde did not escape its destruction. Just 5 months later, in September, having ransacked and destroyed the shrine of St. Swithin at Winchester Cathedral, Thomas Wriothesley wrote to Thomas Cromwell outlining their next plans. In his letter, he states that they intend both at Hyde and at St. Mary's to sweep away all the rotten bones that be called relics, which we may not omit, lest it should be thought that we came more for the treasure than for avoiding the abominations of idolatry. The abbey itself seems to have been dismantled with remarkable speed. Sometime between 1539 and 1542, the antiquarian John Leyland visited the site. He wrote, "In this suburb, the bones of Alfredus, king of the West Saxons, and of Edward his son and king, were translated from Newen Minster and laid in a tomb before the high altar at Hyde." But it's what he says next that really caught my attention. "In the which tomb was alate found 2 little tables of lead, inscribed with their names." Now, whether Leyland meant tables or tablets of lead, I'm unsure, but the meaning seems clear enough. He appears to be describing lead identification plaques bearing the names of Alfred and Edward. More intriguingly, he implies that the tombs had been opened not long before his visit.
These 2 accounts are the first sources I was able to find that describe the possible disturbance of Alfred's burial place at Hyde. And so I thought to myself, well, that's it then. The search is over. Clearly this is a dead end. But then I began to look more closely at Alfred's status after death. And unlike some medieval figures, Alfred was venerated more as a holy king than as a saint associated with miracles, healing, and pilgrimage.
As far as the evidence suggests, Alfred never developed a widespread cult of his own. Winchester already had its great centre of pilgrimage, the shrine of St. Swithin at Winchester Cathedral, a saint whose relics attracted generations of pilgrims.
So is it possible that Alfred's burial place was never viewed as a target for destruction in the same way as other religious relics?
Their attention may instead have been focused on other shrines within Hyde Abbey, those they deemed to fit more closely with the crime of idolatry. If that was the case, though, what exactly was Leyland referring to? And the disturbance doesn't end there. According to Edward Edwards, yes, I did just say that correctly, sometime in the decades following the Reformation, William Camden described Hyde as being deformed with heaps of ruins, daily dug up to burn into lime. As the centuries passed, the royal burial place seems to have mostly faded from memory. In the nearly 200 years since the Dissolution, much disturbance had fallen on the old ruins of Hyde, and it seems unlikely anything would be left of Alfred. By 1723, the landscape had become little more than a scatter of pits and exposed foundations. But towards the end of the 18th century, something happens that eventually leads to a TV show claiming the bones of King Alfred the Great are very likely buried right here in this car park. In 1788, plans for a new house of correction called a bridewell, or Bridwell, come to Winchester. A bridewell was a minor local prison designed to reform petty criminals, vagrants, and the so-called idle poor, through mandatory hard labour rather than long-term detention. One of these bridewells was being constructed just north of the city, directly over the site of the former Hyde Abbey church. And this is where the source that opened this video becomes important. In 1798, antiquarian Henry Howard wrote a letter that was read before the Society of Antiquaries, describing discoveries made a decade earlier during construction work at the site. Accompanying his account was a hand-drawn map that Howard had prepared himself, illustrating the location of the finds. According to some of the newspaper reports, Graham claims that Henry Howard's account states that after their discovery, Alfred's remains were reburied. But Graham doesn't actually say this. What Graham does argue is that Howard's account identifies the location to which the remains were moved after they were discovered.
So, naturally, the first place I wanted to look was at Howard's letter and the map that he created.
But before we do take a closer look at it, it's worth mentioning that Howard himself included a warning in his letter as to the reliability of his map. I have added a rough drawing, to which I shall make references, but must forewarn you not to expect great accuracy, as the plan and measurements are taken solely by stepping the ground in different directions, and without instruments or chain. This is a close-up of the footprint, and it makes more sense if I turn it this way, as you'll soon see. Here I've marked the river and the stream that flowed around the site at the time. According to Howard, the area marked out in green sits 2 feet above the level of the land around it, and he notes that this is the field that was purchased for the construction of Bridewell. This whole area would have been cleared by the convicts. The prison itself can be seen here, whilst here is a footprint of the Abbey church. Where I come in, Howard has already given a brief description of the layout of the foundations.
So let's begin by looking at Howard's account of what was uncovered.
About A was also found a stone coffin cased with lead both within and without, and containing some bones and remains of garments. There were 2 other coffins and no more found in this part. At H, there were remains of a solid basis of masonry and fragments of several small columns of Purbeck marble. May not this have been part of the high altar, or of the tomb of Alfred near it? Possibly the 2 other coffins contained the remains of Edward and of Queen Alswitha. If these finds were still in their original context, then they could very well have been the royal coffins of Alfred and his family. So where are these coffins now? Sadly, this is where my heart sank. In the 3rd paragraph of Howard's letter, we get the first indication of what he was told happened to these remains. You will lament with me the failure of my researches and feel some share of the same indignation when I inform you that the ashes of the great Alfred, having been scattered about by the rude hands of convicts, are now probably covered by a building erected for their confinement and punishment, And when you are told that this occurred so late as the year 1788 and that no one in the neighbourhood, led either by curiosity or veneration for his remains, attempted to discover or rescue them from this ignoble fate, your surprise will not, I think, be less than my own. A quick side note, Howard refers to these remains as ashes. However, elsewhere they are described as bones. Considering what we know of traditional Christian burial, this is clearly a respectful or poetic use of the word, rather than a literal description of cremated remains. A little later in his letter, Howard provides further details, and I'll now share the part I previously left out. About A was also found a stone coffin cased with lead both within and without, and containing some bones and remains of garments. The lead, in its decayed state, sold for 2 guineas. The bones were thrown about, and the stone coffin broken into pieces. He then adds, there were 2 other coffins and no more found in this part, which were also for the sake of the garden in which they lay, broken and buried as low as the spring. But there is an important detail here. At no point in Howard's letter does he state exactly where these broken coffins were buried. The phrase as low as the spring could be interpreted in a number of ways, including that they were buried on the lower ground, or that they were buried exactly where they lay, but much lower, to where the hole started filling with water. Either way, Howard does not provide an exact location for where these fragments ended up. And yet, this is exactly what is claimed in the show. And here is the crucial point. The only time Howard mentions the actual bones is when he describes them as having been thrown about by the convicts or scattered by them. Nowhere in this letter does he say that these bones were gathered up and reburied alongside the fragments of the coffins. In fact, if this had happened, wouldn't Mr. Howard, a man who took the trouble to document the event, the site, and produce a map for reference, have mentioned such an important detail? Of course, we can't rule out the possibility that for whatever reason he did leave that out, but we also can't assume the bones were buried either. As we heard earlier, Howard also writes that the bones are now probably covered by a building erected for their confinement and punishment. Let's set aside Howard's map now and take a look at a more accurate depiction of where the Bridewell was situated. Okay, I say accurate, but I've had to improvise somewhat. As is often the case for those of us on YouTube, I can't just upload any old image I like. Boo. So, despite the fact that I've been able to view a good number of historical and modern excavation maps, I do not have the permission to add them here. But on each of these maps, the Bridewell building is much further away from the burial site than Howard depicts it to be. The area shaded in green shows the rough outline of the land that Howard said was purchased by Bridewell. Now, if I zoom in and overlay Howard's map to match up the features, the shape of the east end of the church footprint fits nicely with the shape of the land bordering the car park today. This is a more accurate placement for where the Bridewell compound would have been, very close to the river that's still there today. This is the burial site, and this whole area in red was outside of the prison grounds, over a branch off the river that's no longer visible. Why would those working on the site use up more time and energy to cross a ditch with a stream carrying heavy broken up fragments of coffins to bury them when they had plenty of land to use for the purpose already? Could the bones have been thrown over there? Absolutely, but it's unlikely anything would be left if they had never been reburied. And they could have been thrown anywhere. One claim in the papers was that the university had snubbed the show's request to investigate the theory using ground-penetrating radar. I think that's fairly strong language. But considering all the evidence I've explored so far, I can understand why Winchester University and other academic institutions may be reluctant to commit significant time and funding to a search for Alfred the Great's remains. The site has been repeatedly disturbed over the centuries. The Abbey was dismantled, the ground was excavated, buildings were constructed, demolished and replaced. And although I'm not going to go into detail here, since 1788 the area has also been excavated on several occasions. With such a complex history of disturbance, identifying the location of any of Alfred's remains would be incredibly challenging. However,
there is something I can share with you. And I would put money on the fact that some of you in the know may already have written it in the comments.
The location I'm standing in here is called Hyde Abbey Garden. It's a memorial garden that marks the site of the former Hyde Abbey church. The garden traces the outline of the church's east end, including the burial place of King Alfred the Great, his wife Ailswith, and their son Edward the Elder. In 2010, a community heritage organisation called Hyde 900 was established to celebrate the 900th anniversary of Hyde Abbey. It was a project that would eventually lead them into the search for Alfred. In 2013, whilst examining finds from earlier excavations at Hyde Abbey, archaeologist Dr. Katie Tucker identified a small fragment of pelvic bone that had originally been recovered during community excavations between 1995 and 1999. The fragment had been found in the area of the high altar, the very spot where these ledger stones now lie, and where tradition places the burial of King Alfred the Great almost 900 years earlier. The fragment had not initially been recognised as significant, and in fact it had been mistaken for animal bone. But once it was clear it was human, it was identified as very likely adult male. Through radiocarbon dating, it produced a date range of AD 895 to 1017. An osteological analysis resulted in an age range of 26 to 45 plus years old at death. Together with the stable isotope results, archaeologists concluded that there was a very high possibility this bone belonged to one of the West Saxon royal family, most likely Alfred himself or his son Edward the Elder. Neither the show nor the vast majority of recent news reports mentioned this information. My friend Paul has also covered this story. Some of it will be familiar if you've watched this video, but some of it will be fresh. If you'd like to see how another creator has pieced the evidence together, go and check out his video. I will leave a link in the description below.
So there we go, folks. This is the car park. Is Alfred still here? What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. And if you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and make sure you hit that notification button so you don't miss an upload. And I will see you guys next time.